There we go. So glad to take any questions along the way or at the end, whatever makes sense. Certainly just stop me. Okay. So a couple of topics to talk about today. Sir, we're currently in a preliminary design status. Our current contract is just preliminary design. So I want to talk a little bit about that, a little bit about the Clean Water SRF funding application that we submitted in the fall of last year. There's some testing protocols that are associated with the treatment plant, which affects the schedule and timing of that. And then also just looking at our anticipated timeline and schedule with respect to the plant itself, where you're at from a current capacity standpoint, how long it takes to actually get to that, having that plant installed and constructed. Just a quick aerial view of the existing facilities. This is your utility site. The wastewater treatment plant there is a self-contained system in the red square. It's also co-located with your water treatment plant on the same site. Okay. And currently the treatment plant is rated at 300,000 gallons per day. That's an average daily flow, and that's by permit. And we projected build out about 650,000 gallons per day, plus or minus. The good news is that we have a disposal capacity already of 650,000 gallons per day. Treating the wastewater is one part of it, but the real challenge often is how you dispose of that treated effluent. Fortunately, we went through a lot of machinations a few years ago to acquire up to 650,000 gallons per day of effluent disposal. So we're in really good shape from that perspective. That includes a combination of high rate infiltration basins, which are located on the golf course, and then also reuse on the golf course. So depending on flow, demand times, those are two tools that the island has, a village has to be able to dispose of that effluent. So in concurrent with that, the expansion that we're looking at is to take that plant from 300,000 gallons per day up to 650,000 gallons per day. Okay. We did a study a couple of years ago, and we evaluated different treatment processes. And this is the three, kind of a quick snapshot of the three that we looked at. You currently have what's referred to as an SBR, which is a sequencing batch reactor, which means that we bring the wastewater in and we treat it all at one time in a batch, and then we dispose of it. So we looked at that from an expansion standpoint. We also looked at a combination of what's referred to as an IFAS, which is integrated fixed film activated sludge. And it's just another process that works in these types of situations. We also looked at an MBR, which is a membrane bioreactor. All three of these are good processes, but the SBR is not only the most cost effective, but also works really well for the island. It's very flexible with low and high flows. And in the wintertime, you have really low flows. In the summertime, you have really high peaks. The SBR gives you a lot of flexibility in that batch process. So while these are viable alternatives, expanding your existing SBR and the size of the plant, it made the most sense. So that was our recommendation. And it was also the most cost effective. And the number I showed in red was from 2019. We recently, as I mentioned, we submitted an application to SRF in the fall. That application, we bumped that number up a little bit because of the supply chain shortages and the things we're seeing to 13. And quite frankly, it would surprise me if the plant's not approaching 50. If you build it right now, 15, 16 million, just because of the cost that we've seen. Heavy municipal construction is probably a 30% increase in the past year and a half. And then being on the island makes it even a little bit more challenging because of the challenge of getting equipment back and forth, contractors back and forth. So, and these other two would also go up in concert with that same thing. So still the SBR is going to be your least expensive option. So we're again moving forward with that. And just quickly, what does that look like? Wastewater comes in the plant at the influent screen, and then there's an EQ basin, which is that square you see there in the middle. Point to, and leaving there, it goes to the 3 SBR basins. And the SBRs are a biological process. We use microorganisms to treat the waste, and that's really the heart of your process. Leaving there, it goes up to the top right. There's a filtering process that happens, and there's UV for disinfection, ultraviolet. Then it's disposed of again on the golf course or in the filtration basins. There's also a side process, and we're treating the wastewater, we're pulling out organics and those sort of things. Those also have to be treated separately. Those are handled in the biosolids tanks. You see there's 3 tanks there. And then once they are treated to the level they need to be, they can be land applied. And that's a very common process in municipal wastewater treatment process. So that's your current process. Okay. So the expansion, we're gonna certainly replace the screen. The screen you have now is really, I think it's in poor shape. Number one, it's also not sized properly for the expansion. So we'll be replacing, upgrading that. We'll be making some modifications to the existing SBR basins to make them more efficient. And one of the biggest things that really helps us to add capacity is we're going to convert a digester, which is for biosolids, which is this big one here, to another SBR basin. So we add additional actual biological treatment in the process. By doing that, and also by increasing the plant, you're going to have more biosolids that are generated. So we're going to have to construct some additional biosolids digester handling, which is shown here on the right-hand side of the screen. And then we'll need a new mechanical building that part of the biological process is controlling air. You have to add air, take air away to make the biology work. So we'll need some additional air components there. And so we'll have a separate building for that. There's some, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, there's some existing structures there. Those are all temporary, JP, I believe. Yes. And they'll all be relocated. So at least from a treetop level, this is the concept we put together for expanding the plant. And fortunately, it looks like we're going to be able to do it on the existing footprint we have, which I think is very much positive. So work in progress. We've completed a site survey. And one of the things we have some concerns over is setbacks. Treatment facilities, the rules have certain setbacks from habitable residences, property lines, environmental concerns. So as part of that survey, we want to make sure we evaluate the design, the layout, so we can comply with those regulatory requirements, which is really important for the site survey. We're evaluating some of the preliminary info. I mentioned the screen needs to be upgraded, so we're looking at some alternatives for that. Timber Creek Pump Station is your main influent pump station. It brings the bulk of flow to the plant. That's going to have to be upgraded for the capacity. There's also what we refer to as an effluent pump station. Once it gets treated, the effluent pump station actually delivers that treated wastewater out to the golf course and to the infiltration basin. So those are a couple components that we're currently evaluating in our preliminary design process. However, one thing we've been concerned about is looking at some of the past data. The summertime peak loading, when I talk about peak loading, I talk about the strength of the wastewater. How strong is that wastewater, and what do we have to do to treat it? In the summertime, we see some pretty high loading here, probably higher than what we'd see anywhere else. We have some data from maybe 13 or 14, and our concern is that's not old enough, nor is it representative of what we need to design. So we've asked the village and JP and his staff to do some testing in the summertime, because that's when we see it, primarily June and July. And so what occurs there is if we design on the information we have, we either undersize the facility or oversize the facility. Neither is good. You undersize, you can't meet treatment. You oversize, you spend too much money, right? So we want to make sure we get the right numbers and size it appropriately. So that's the reason for the summertime testing protocol. Again, we've asked for that to be done in June or July, which is typically your highest loading months.
With respect to the hydraulics of the effluent to the discharge lagoons, is it too soon to say, will there be any significant impacts to the lagoons themselves that we may have to work with the club on to do some rework of that, or are they sufficient to handle?
They're sufficient. We went through the disposal process a few years ago and got that permit. That was all taken care of that.
So it was based on build out.
Based on build out.
Okay.
So I think, again, that's a very positive for us. We're just really talking about the plant. And disposal is always a challenge in wastewater treatment. So that's, again, it's very, very good. We went through that process. It was a tough process, but we got there. Yeah, so no real impacts to that current system. And so again, the testing parameters, we provided JP a list of what we think needs to be tested, and I think you guys have that scheduled, and we're moving forward with that. And the reason I point that out is we feel like it makes sense to kind of put the brakes on any other detailed evaluation until we have that testing protocol in place and allow us to correctly size the facilities. So what does that do for us for timeline? And I think we talked about this a couple of years ago. I made a similar presentation. The state of North Carolina has two triggers for when you need to upgrade a treatment plant. It's called the 80-90 rule. Basically, at 80% of your capacity, you have to be in planning. You have to have an engineering report or maybe moving forward with design. It's sort of a checkbox for the state to say, okay, we know you're thinking about it. You're not going to get caught shorthanded and not have enough capacity. Second rule is a 90% trigger. That is when your plant hits 90%, you have to be in construction. You have to have a signed construction contract, or else the state will issue a moratorium. No building permits or no additional sewer extensions. Fortunately, I've been through this a couple of times. I just went through it recently with a client that kind of sort of got called short, and I can assure you they will not lift the moratorium until that contract is signed. So it was a real challenge for that client. So where are you at today? 80% of 240,000, 300,000 is 240. Did we skip a slide? I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. That's it. So the 80-90 rule, and as we talk about your flow, is typically the 80-90 rule is based on a 12-month average, and that's really a mischaracterization for the island because the island's so unique. If you did the 12-month average, you would probably never hit the 80-90 rule. It's really the summertime peak. So the state and the island has always looked at the summertime peaks being that's the 80-90 trigger is based on that summertime peak. And to go one step further with that, the state will issue notice of a violation, NOV, if you exceed your 300,000 gallon per day capacity in any 30-day average period. So even more so beyond the 12-month period, that 30-day period is very, very important when it comes to looking at your capacity, which is why we look at that June, July, August timeframe. And again, that says that 80% of your 300 is 240, 90% is 270. July of 2020, you did 254, and July of this past year, you did 245. So you're, even in your highest month, you've eclipsed the 80% part of that. Okay. The good news is that with that 80% trigger we're just talking about, we've already completed an engineering report. We're already at least in a preliminary design mode. So from the state's perspective, we check that box for 80%. So we're good. What we really want to be concerned about is 90%. And just sort of doing the math here at 270,000 gallons per day, less what you did last summer, 245, that leaves you about 24,000 gallons of actually capacity left that you can allocate and have houses or whatever built to be served by. Your current allocation per home is 237 gallons per day per home. That equates to a little over 100 homes. I think that also may be a little bit of not exactly accurate because that's a 12-month average, and there's a lot of homes here that have a significant number of bedrooms, and they're rented out with 10 people show up. That number is probably higher in the summertime. It may average 237, but it may be 500 gallons per home per day in the summertime. And so it's kind of, sir.
That's a number that we work with Limited Ken for many years to come up with, and it's been a while since we, I think, reevaluated that. To the point, is that something that we should reassess?
So I think
Tony and I have been talking about it.
Yeah, I think in the permit renewal process, you're supposed to renew or review it every 5 or 6 years. Yeah, I think it's a good process to do. The state stipulates 120 gallons per day per bedroom, assuming a 3-bedroom house is 360 gallons per day. We went to the state a few years ago and said, hey, if you look at our total number of houses and the flow we're doing, it's really more like 237 gallons per day, which is great because it gives you a little bit more capacity in a treatment plant. But that only lasts for so long. At some point, it catches up to you. But you do have to review that occasionally.
Right, because I think there's been a shift, and maybe the mayor could speak from an architectural standpoint, that the style of the homes that are being built today have more bathrooms in them to accommodate more people, therefore more flow, versus what has been traditionally built out on Bald Head many years ago.
And I think, just if you look at our accommodation tax, we're obviously renting a whole lot more houses. And what you're finding is, your house that theoretically the normal family would look at as, oh, this is good for a family of 5, is a rental for 12.
Yeah. That's exactly what we were seeing. And so this is an average for 12 months. For those 2 or 3 months it's rented out, it may be 2 or 3 times that. We run into this a lot on the coastal environment. The Washington regional office up north has been really hard on us with this to make sure we're counting for those larger houses because the 360 just isn't applicable most of the time.
But there is a little difference than down here, that up there in Dare County and Doug and Corolla, with Currituck County, they're building these 4-story big mansions that can sleep 25. And, you know,
So the 80-90 trigger is not based on paper flow. It's really based on real flow. So that's the other thing. We talk about these numbers, we estimate that, but it's really, you know, JP does a report every year. It's 12-month average is X or it's 3-month average is X. That's the trigger. They're looking for real flow. You can allocate above or beyond, but when your real flow hits those numbers, which, you know, again, you're getting close to that, that's when you have to be meeting those thresholds for the state. So thinking about timeline and my discussion about, we probably need to put the brakes on things a little bit until we get those summer peaks. What does it look like from a timeline? Well, assuming we went ahead and moved forward with the design in spring or the fall, sorry, you're probably looking at about 16 months to do design permitting bid to where we can actually say we have a construction contract and check that box for the 90% rule. So I don't really have a feel for this. We haven't looked at this in detail, but, you know, if you only have 100 homes to build, you know, sort of what does that build out? What does that absorption rate look like to where you hit that 90% rule? But just from a point of discussion, you know, that would keep you out of the moratorium at that point. And then I think we're looking at, you know, maybe a year and a half to 2 years to construct. That may be a little longer now. In today's market, based on supply shortages, by the time we get there, maybe that's alleviated a bit. But for right now, that's sort of what we're looking at. But it's about a 3-year process to have your plant designed, permitted, constructed, in operation. A lot of numbers. Does all that make sense?
And when we're looking at, so 102 homes, we're averaging 20-25 as at most.
Yeah, right now, that's about where it's at.
25.
Yeah.
So you've got a few years there. Okay.
I think just for target purpose, I think we're talking about, we've been targeting the summer of 2024 is to when at least clearly have our permit and design in hand so that we can engage into a bid so that we don't fall into a moratorium situation.
So we start the process 2024.
We started the process actually
Well,
6 or 8 months ago.
Exactly.
But we're talking about Kenny.
But and we have some, with this timeline that Tony has shown here, I think we have there's a little extra room built into that. That's why I mentioned it.
Okay.
For summer of 2024.
Got it.
in this current budget, we approved the preliminary engineering design
Right.
work. And the upcoming budget will need to include the phase 2 of that.
Phase 2.
Right.
We're waiting to hear about SRF, if we got any potential there.
So we have to roll money from the budget into next year, unless I misunderstood you. You're redoing some capacities this summer, or you did last summer, took for the peak capacities.
No, we're good on those.
We're done. Okay, so the design is going to get rolled into next year.
We triggered the 80 and we're approaching the 90 trigger. So we're just making sure that we make that timing work so that there's no moratorium.
And I always point this out to other clients that are sort of the situation is that you can get the design and permit, and if you're not ready, you can hold off from spending the money on the construction. That's where the big dollars are at, but you're at least at a point that if it becomes an issue, you can bid really fast. Again, stay away from that 90% rule.
And we're shovel ready.
Shovel ready, absolutely. That's another issue.
The term you hear often when we talk about grants.
And as JP mentioned, the Clean Water SRF, we did submit this in September, which is administered through the Division of Water Infrastructure. They have 2 funding cycles a year. It's normally September and March. We did make the September submittal. We typically hear either now or March. So we're in that. I checked it yesterday. I have not seen a notification yet. And unfortunately, I don't think this project is going to score well under current funding. They really are focused on rehab projects, failing projects, people that have failing systems, 50-year-old terracotta pipe, a rather affluent area they just need to expand. It checks some points, but it doesn't check enough. So what typically happens, you have a lot of projects go in, they score them, and the top scorers get the funding and the others don't. I've done a number of these. I just, being honest, I don't think we're going to score very high. That hurt to submit it. You do have an opportunity to resubmit. You can either take your application back and try to punch it up, get some more points, or you can just write a letter and say, please resubmit it in the fall or the next cycle. That's important this year. The cycle we just submitted for is a typical SRF cycle. The recent stimulus funding that came out, most of that money is going to hit SRF in the fall. I can tell you they're struggling to figure out what to do with it, because it's not just a typical, here's we're going to fund these type of projects. There's other types of projects they're going to fund. Their application process isn't set up for it. I don't think personally they're staffed for it to handle it. This reminds me of the AURA funding we got back in '09, which was a real challenge for the state and for most consultants trying to get through it. But hopefully they're a little bit better prepared this time. That being said, I think there may be an opportunity for some additional funding there that we would not have had originally. There's just a lot more money. There's a lot more opportunity there. I haven't seen any updated scoring. If they keep the scoring the same, we're again not going to score very well. But if there's more money available, they may push the limit down a little bit. We may have a better opportunity to do that. So we have a staff of people that follow the funding. We're going to go through some training with the state in a couple of weeks, I believe, and they're going to go through what this next round of funding cycle looks like. And hopefully we can work with Chris and JP to identify a means of going after, assuming we don't get funded this cycle, if there's some ability there for us to get funded in that cycle. So, but at the very least, I don't think it hurts to resubmit, even with what you have. Even if you don't get funded, it's a really low cost to resubmit one way or the other. So, any questions on that?
Not a question, but just a comment, I guess, to Jerry's point about cost benefit associated with the grant, and how we try to tie in what Tony's doing relative to what Steve can try to accomplish at the federal level, and how we kind of bring them together to be successful in getting these funds. And when you talk about SRF, it's either you can have a zero interest loan, you can have grant funds or a zero interest or a low interest.
Correct. Or some combination thereof.
Right.
Yeah, and that and the process is pretty formulaic in the SRF process. The application is, it's based on your household income or your median income, your financial rates, what you're charging your customers. And if you do the math, they actually tell you what percentage of grant you qualify for. For you, it's zero, unfortunately. That doesn't mean you can't get grant. I've done some projects where we did not check that box, but we still got grant money. But it kind of plays in that same discussion of, the project doesn't score well, the affluency of the island doesn't help in that type of funding under the current SRF funding. Now, again, when the stimulus bill money hits in the fall, that may be a different animal, different story for us. So something we need to monitor and see if there's a possibility for us to be able to acquire that. Okay. So just in wrapping up, next steps, we're going to continue with the preliminary design. JP is going to help us get the sampling, and it'll help us to refine and actually, as part of that, that preliminary design, we'll do an updated cost opinion, which we could share what we really think it's going to cost in those dollars and have a better handle on that. And then as we discussed, we certainly want to evaluate the funding or any other types of funding that may be available. It's not just SRF, but there's this other funding available that may help us build the project. So that's all I had. I'd be glad to take any additional questions.
Tony, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.